Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into the world of childcare, but probably not in the way you're used to thinking about it. We're going to unpack a really fascinating framework that sees childcare as this living, breathing, and yeah, sometimes completely paradoxical system. Let's get right into it.
So to get started, I want you to just consider a kind of weird question. What if we just stopped thinking about a daycare as, a building with some toys and some teachers? What if it was something else entirely?
And there it is. That's the core image for this whole idea. A daycare as an Ouroboros, that ancient kind of mythical symbol. Now I know it sounds bizarre, but you gotta stick with me here, because this one single image, it unlocks a really powerful way of seeing how early education actually works on the ground.
Okay, so what is an Ouroboros really? Well, it's a symbol of a completely closed loop. It's a self-feeding system where the end is always the beginning. Every single thing that comes out of it, every effect, it just immediately cycles right back around and becomes a new input, a new cause.
So let's dive into our first section here, a snake eating itself. We're about to see how this ancient symbol becomes a surprisingly accurate map for the modern daycare.
The huge idea here is that a daycare isn't just a place. The source material calls it a holistic manifold. Now, that sounds super academic, right? But just think of it like a self-contained bubble where every single thing, every action, every emotion, every decision is all deeply connected, and it all cycles back. Nothing ever happens in a vacuum.
And this is where you can really see it in action. A teacher's stress or their joy, that isn't just their own private feeling. In this system, it becomes the input for a child's sense of security. And that kid's feeling of safety, well, that becomes the input for a parent's trust in the center. And you guessed it, that trust directly feeds the center's financial health, which of course affects the teacher's job security and their emotions. And just like that, the snake eats its own tail.
And this is a perfect example of how that loop can become totally destructive. They call it the teacher burnout loop. It kicks off with low pay and high stress. That leads to an absolutely staggering staff turnover rate. We're talking up to 40% a year in some cases. When those teachers leave, a child's secure attachments get shattered. And that disruption, it often leads to more behavioral problems in the classroom, which puts even more stress on the staff who are left, which, of course, causes more of them to burn out and leave. The system literally starts to consume itself.
All right, so let's move on. If the daycare is this living system, this serpent, well, what are its different parts? The source material gives us a really clear map of the whole ecosystem.
This framework breaks it all down into 4 core parts. First, you have the child, called the autonomous part. They're just driven by their own curiosity. Then you've got the educator, the adaptive part, who's kind of like this system's thermostat, always trying to keep things in balance. The parent is the relational part, that absolutely vital bridge connecting home and school. And finally, you have the environment itself, the systemic part. And it's not just a backdrop, it's seen as a third teacher that actively shapes everyone's behavior. Okay, now this is where the whole model gets really interesting. It argues that this system isn't some calm, perfectly balanced loop. Nope. It's actually powered by constant tension, by what it calls the engine of paradox.
And here is the absolute game-changing insight. This whole framework argues you shouldn't solve these paradoxes. You don't get rid of the friction. The whole point is to harness that tension. That constant push and pull isn't a flaw in the system. It's the very engine that makes kids grow. And the biggest, most fundamental tension of all is this one: safety versus risk. I mean, think about it. On one hand, you have the absolute non-negotiable need for safety. Regulations, parents, our own gut instincts, they all scream, protect the child from all harm. But on the other hand, you have the child's deep biological need for risky play. To climb too high, to run too fast, to test their own limits. That's how they learn. It's how they build resilience.
So the solution here isn't about picking a side. It's about finding this incredible balance. The goal isn't what's called surplus safety, where you try to bubble wrap the world and end up with fragile kids. No, the goal is a safe challenge. Creating a space where kids can take real, manageable risks, where the feeling of danger is thrilling, but the actual catastrophic consequences have been engineered.
And then there's the economic paradox, what the source material calls the industry's Gordian knot. It's a real brain breaker. See, high-quality care is incredibly expensive. It requires small class sizes and professional, well-paid educators. But at the exact same time, for care to be accessible, it has to have low tuition, because the parents using it are often just starting their careers.
So you have super high costs and super low revenue. It feels like an impossible equation to solve.
So all of this brings us to our final section. With all this complexity, these feedback loops, these paradoxes, why should we care so deeply about getting this system right? Well, because the payoff is just astonishingly clear.
Look, we've gone deep on a snake eating its tail, on paradoxes and living systems, and it's totally fair to ask, okay, but what's the so what here? Why does all this abstract theory actually matter in the real world?
Let's just boil it all down to one question. If we can actually manage these forces, if we can make this daycare Ouroboros a healthy, thriving system, what is that really worth?
The answer comes down to this single, incredibly powerful number: 13%.
That's it. That's the annual return on investment for society, for every single dollar spent on high-quality early childhood programs. And this isn't some made-up number. It comes from the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman. A 13% annual ROI, that's better than the historical average of the stock market. It is an investment that pays for itself over and over and over again in better health, higher earnings, and lower crime rates down the line.
And so we end right back where we started. The ultimate goal of this whole system, this daycare Ouroboros, is what the framework calls the radiant chomp. It's the snake finally doing its job in the best way possible, consuming all the chaos, all the risk, all the paradoxes of growing up, and using that energy to create something absolutely incredible, a strong, capable, and resilient human being. So the question it really leaves us with is this: are we feeding the serpent, or are we letting it starve?